All right, we are now recording. Hello and welcome back to Welty at Home, the slow reading virtual book club that alternates works by Eudora Welty with works by authors connected to Welty. We are currently exploring Jesmyn Ward's novel, Sing, Unburied, Sing. During this series, we have read and discussed about 40 to 50 pages of the book each week, and today is our final discussion, finishing. I'm Anna Traylor, the education specialist at Eudora Welty House and Garden, and we are grateful to Suzanne Mars, Eudora Welty's friend and biographer and professor emerita of Millsaps College, for guiding these discussions. And we are especially grateful to our guest instructor for leading our discussion for this series, Dr. Kamisha Randall Swanson. She is professor at Mississippi State University, author of Maverick Feminist, and editor of the forthcoming Conversations with Jesmyn Ward. First, some quick housekeeping. To comment or ask a question, click the reactions button at the bottom of your screen and select raise hand. If you're on a tablet or a phone, you may have to tap the screen for this option to appear. A lively discussion often takes place in the chat as well, so be sure to glance over at that chat box every now and again. So with that, Kamisha or Suzanne, where shall we begin our discussion?
I'm not seeing Kamisha. Are you here? Well, let me start us off. I think she has class, so she'll be here in a minute. But I'll start us off. I thought these were such powerful chapters, each one of them, building on the previous one and sort of rocking everything that we've been reading, reverberating with everything that we've read before. So why don't we start with, let's start at the very beginning, a very good place to start. Let's start with Richie here and talk about his chapter before we move on. Does anyone want to start us off about Richie's chapter and what effect it has on us as we begin reading? Of his vision that he has of Golden Isle and what we're to make of that. And it's on page 241. Across the face of the water there is land. It is green and hilly, dense with trees, riven by rivers. The rivers flow backward. They begin in the sea and end inland. The air is gold, the gold of sunrise and sunset, perpetually peach. There are homes set atop mountain ranges, in valleys, on beaches. They are vivid blue and dark red, cloudy pink and deepest purple. They are yurts and adobe dwellings and teepees and longhouses and villas. Some of the homes are clustered together in small villages, graceful gatherings of round, steady huts with domed roofs. And there are cities that harbor plazas and canals and buildings bearing minarets and hip and gable roofs and crouching beasts and massive skyscrapers that look as if they could collapse to weirdly flower in the sky, yet they do not. There are people, tiny and distinct. They fly and walk and float and run. They are alone. They are together. They wander the summits. They swim in the rivers and sea. They walk hand in hand in the parks and the squares, disappear into the buildings. They are never silent. Ever present is their singing. They don't move their mouths, and yet it comes from them, crooning in the yellow light. It comes from the black earth and the trees and the ever lit sky. It comes from the water. It is the most beautiful song I have ever heard, but I can't understand a word. So why don't we start there and talk about that passage?
Kamisha has joined us. We were just on page 241.
Thank you.
Hey, Kamisha, welcome.
Thank you. Sorry, my class went a little over today.
Yeah, I figured that's what happened. I started us off with a passage, and we'll see if we get anyone wants to comment on it. From Richie on page 241, the vision he has. Harriet.
Yeah, so I'm thinking, I'm of course interested in the song, and um, And at the end of that section, the end of this chapter, if I remember right, is I keen. That is, there's this song has got like different tones to it. There's a song that is coming from the tiny, indistinct people. It is beautiful. And there's also Richie's keening. Um, uh, and um, and I just was interested in that.
Yeah, he says, my hands strike nothing. They rend no doorways to that golden isle. Absence, isolation, I keen. So there's the keening, and then there's the beautiful song that he can't understand. And so those two tones of hope and fulfillment and
Yeah.
renewal and grief. Yeah.
Yeah, and those are themes that are, I guess, kind of customary in Ward's works. Also, I especially liked that line, the last line that you said, but I can't understand. I think that that speaks to, again, him being kind of tethered between these two worlds. He's been longing, and then now he's having these dreams. That speaks to, I guess, Leonie's previous dream and other chapters and other dreams that have been mentioned previously, how they kind of foreshadow what's to come, but this hope that he would hear the story and then be able to reach whatever that beyond place is over the water. But now he's still longing and dreaming for that, but also not quite understanding, still not comprehending. But this idea of the collective and individual song I thought was interesting too, because this passage in general speaks to trauma. So this individual and collective trauma, we've been talking about how it impacts generations, and Richie is still speaking to that, not being fully able to understand the song because he's still trapped between these two worlds. But I thought that was interesting also.
And this image of the Golden Isle is one of community, of connection, one of the natural beauty. It's one of color, lots of color.
In opposition to a great mouth opens in me in Wales, I empty stomach. Yeah.
But and even at the end of the novel, he's not finding a way through the door. There's no door.
Correct.
Yeah.
Still that longing for freedom, for peace. And I think that that's an overarching message. But we could get to that later. But yeah.
Joellen.
I'm interested in the opening of the chapter, which gets us to that section where on the first page, 239, Richie is observing. He says Riv hugs them even when he's not in the same room, how he feeds for them, cares for them. He witnesses this unit picking strawberries and going along. And he still, then he then his mind switches to, he wants to know what happened to him. He sees Leonie and Michael leave without even taking leave of anyone else. And that little section ends at the bottom of 240. He's making a cot in the earth that night, sleeping below them. And I sing songs without words. The songs come to me out of the same air that brings the sound of the waters. I open my mouth and I hear the rushing of the waves. We're told in that next section that not only can he not sing, he can't hear, I can't remember. Yes, it is. It's the most beautiful song I've ever heard. So there's that vision that's very Edenic. But one thing I noted about it, I'm not sure what to make of this, is that instead of the rivers flowing to the sea, they flow backwards. And I'm not entirely sure what to do with rivers. We've got river, the character, but these rivers begin at the sea and end inland. And it says the air is gold. So those are just a couple of
I was thinking of that too, as the rivers flowing into life, not flowing away from you, but into you, flooding your life, enriching your life. But of course, well, we can talk about the death of Mam too, with the flood.
I think that kind of speaks to the ending too, with them kind of being stuck left here in the trees as birds. They were thinking, Richie was thinking that once he heard his story, he would be able to fly off into the horizon, to the sea. But the fact that it's flowing backwards, that this trauma kind of continues to live on, I think that that speaks to that also.
John Browning offered in the chat, he says he isn't able to speak, but this comment is significant. He says, this is, of course, not Richie's voice, but the author's beautiful translation of his perceptions and vision, a beautiful passage.
Yes,
And
so
Charlotte offers that I loved the idea of him being riven by river.
And I also like we learned that once Lenny goes to visit Given's grave, that their last name is Stone. So this idea of river being river stone was significant. Also, the stones in the river kind of again holding them grounded and solid, but also being rough and rocky as well.
I do think it's marvelous also the way the language of the translating the thoughts is much richer than the language, spoken language. And so you have that dichotomy there.
And she talked about that actually in one of her interviews. That was one of the things that she said she disliked about Faulkner's writing, that the Black characters in his novels didn't seem to have that depth in terms of thought, even if they don't necessarily have what you would think of to be the education or the literacy to speak these things. That doesn't mean that they can't have, I guess, complex thoughts and ideas. So she makes a purpose to make the thoughts that the characters are having much more complex, perhaps, than the language that they speak.
Kamisha, do you think we should move on to JoJo's section, chapter, his first section, chapter 13?
I'm okay with whatever
Anybody,
the majority.
Joelle, did you something else? Yeah, go ahead.
Actually, could we talk about Leonie in the cemetery? The last part of this chapter, he leaves the crawl space.
Yeah.
And Leonie's speaking to Given. So we're actually learning a fair amount about the other characters in the novel from Richie.
Mm-hmm.
As we end the novel.
Yeah. And he sees Given. Richie sees.
Yes. And he gives us his full name. I think it's the only time we learn that the family's name, last name, surname is Stone.
Mm-hmm.
Blaze, or Given Blaze Stone. So
Yes.
River Stone, JoJo Stone, and technically would be, oh no, maybe not. JoJo's has
Joseph's,
they not use it.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's Stone.
Or maybe he doesn't have Michael's name. Beverly?
I had flagged something in the previous reading from chapter, I don't know, it's when JoJo goes in to talk to Ma'am after they get back, and then he tells Ma'am that Michael hit Kayla, and Ma'am is talking about Leonie and saying that something that's not in Leonie, she can't be a mother. And then she makes the statement, she ain't ever going to feed you, which I think is important to what happens at the end of the story, because we've already been prepared for Ma'am knowing and telling JoJo, don't expect anything for her because she ain't ever going to feed you.
Yeah.
And he says something to that effect in his chapter 2, if I'm remembering correctly. He doesn't say the feeding part specifically, but he's speaking to what Ma'am has already shared with him.
The last part about Leonie and Ma'am is interesting too in the show. Valerie, let me go to you first. Valerie and then Alec. Whoops, we can't hear you, Val.
Valerie, if you could unmute.
Yeah. No, it's still muted. I'll tell you what, let's go to Alec and we'll come back to Valerie.
Okay, I was just going to say that the word hollow turns up. This writer is like Miss Welty in that some words just turn up over and over again. And there's several instances of hollowness, like
Mhm.
Leon. She, she ain't ever going to feed you. She knows that she doesn't have the mothering qualities that her own mother does. And when Riv was beating the stumps there in one of the recent chapters, he says they hollowed out, termites got them.
Yeah.
And poor old Richie, he wants more than he's getting. He's a spirit, all right. He's in that other world, but his life was not complete. He wants more than he got from Riv and from his whole experience. So anyway, just that word.
We'll come back to that. Anna, can you unmute Valerie?
I've clicked the ask to unmute button. Is that working for you, Valerie?
Is your computer muted itself?
There's a button down at the bottom of the screen where you should be able to unmute, and then on your,
Yeah, unless the sound is off on your computer. May I jump in for the moment?
yeah, come on.
Absolutely, Joellen.
I think I just love this section. When Leonie is in the cemetery, we start getting a little different view of her. She's speaking to Given. Would you give her what she wants?
Mhm.
And there's a kind of, however the novel ends, whatever Leonie's continued problems, she's been given a challenge. She's been given a job by her mother. And we see her wandering among the tombstones, going straight to the place of the dead. And that's where she begins picking up rocks. But that section still ends with Richie. The tears and the ocean and the blood could burn a hole through the nose. This is just after Leonie has dropped her rocks in front of her mother. And we're told that her mother, looks at her with so much understanding and forgiveness and love that he hears the song again.
Yes.
I know that singing from the Golden Place.
Right. So that this is what he wants. This is what he's looking for: understanding, forgiveness, and love.
Yes.
And
Which is
Bam offers it to Leonie here. Yeah, and he senses it. Okay.
I was going to
We'll
actually
try one
ask
more
about,
time
I'm
with
sorry.
Valerie.
I was going to ask
Ah,
about that
hooray!
scene.
Oh, Valerie's
Yes, I'm
unmuted.
muted.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll let you come in first. Sorry.
You go first, Valerie, and then Commission.
Well, I was remembering our very first discussion of the first chapters, and it was reminding me of the connections between the ancient Greek literature that is so epic and like the Odyssey, the Iliad, those kinds of stories where it's important to bury your dead. And if the dead aren't buried, they roam the world and haunt people. And so you can remember so many stories that the whole mission is to bury the dead. And a very huge travesty is to prevent the burial of the dead. And I think Richie's showing us in a way why that's important in a metaphorical way. To me, his vision is more like heaven, almost like the afterlife, what he would be in if he could be buried and move on like he wants to be. But anyway, I'm just sort of hooking back to those earlier conversations about how this story is so like the ancient stories that we've known for centuries to be about human beings and human life, and our I think our desire for closure.
Yeah. That's what I was going to say. Burial as a sort of metaphor for closure.
Yes. And so sing unburied, sing is like an admonition to those who aren't buried yet.
I think, oh,
Go
sorry.
ahead, Commissioner.
No, I was just gonna say, I think you're spot on. She actually talks about why this was initially supposed to be a travel narrative, is because she wanted to kind of mimic Faulkner's As I Lay Dying, where the whole purpose of the story is to go bury the dead. But also, I that's actually a good segue to the point that I was going to make about giving. At the beginning of our discussion, we questioned whether or not Leonie had a gift, and if that was why she was actually seeing given, or if it was just hallucinations. But we know that Kayla now can see given as well. One, when we talked about well, she can see ghosts and spirits in general. But there are at least two interactions where her and Given seem to be in conversation with one another. But when Leonie goes to the graveyard and she sees his tombstone, she says, "You ain't never here." So even though Given has been physically buried, he also suffered a very violent death like Richie. So I think that that's an interesting parallel and connective as well, which is why we see them kind of warring in the next chapter. So his body is physically buried, but the spirit has suffered so many other things that it's still kind of tethered to that world also.
I think it's a fascinating chapter where they gather in Mam's room, and there's Leonie and Kayla and Given, and ultimately Pop and JoJo as well. So should we move on to that chapter?
Sure.
You want to, Anisha, you want to start us off?
Yeah. So I'm looking for the particular passage. We know that, of course, JoJo starts off by following Pop. He tells us again that he means to walk like him, his head up, shoulders straight. But then he goes on to ask him to tell him the end of the story, and he talks about while he's hearing the story, how he's seen a side of Pop that he's never seen before. Even when we get back to Leonie's chapter, she says she's never seen him stumped over. He's always been straight, upright. JoJo says things like his hands are soft, or he doesn't know what to do with them. So they're getting to see a different side of Riv, where he has basically tried to mimic everything about his life. But this is again where you see generational trauma impacting. There's a certain part of his life that he does not know about, and now we have to wonder, because Richie has said things like, "You'll never be able to protect her," if JoJo might find himself with a similar fate, having to do something so horrible, so bad, because he loves and is trying to protect someone else. So I just thought that, of course, the story itself was impactful. And I know that a lot of people had questions about the ending, specifically why the title was Seeing Unburied, saying why Pop didn't want to have dogs anymore. So I was definitely interested in hearing you all's thoughts on now actually getting the end of the story as well.
So we've got JoJo finally taking Richie to Pop and getting the story. Finally, here's the complete story. What about this chapter then? Y'all want to talk about? The story is just horrifying.
Yeah. No, we've been talking about adultification too. I thought it was interesting. I'm sorry, I see someone's coming, but I just thought it was interesting that JoJo has to tell Pop without telling him that he's ready, he's prepared, that he can hear, in a similar way that Pop had to, that Richie wanted to tell the Sunshine Lady that he could hear the story about the lynching. So there are lots of parallels in this text.
I thought it was interesting that Pop was compared to a buzzard circling around the corpse, not coming in. And so we've got that image of Pop associated with death. Okay, so we have Kathy and Harriet.
So I wonder what is the significance of Pop taking a termite-ridden trap or cage apart while he's unveiling this story? I felt like that had to mean something, but I wasn't sure what.
The story could have been eating him from the inside, kind of like the termites. It needed to be let out. Yeah.
Harriet and Joe Ellen.
I'm thinking on the one hand about our national race rape complex, and which is driving action. But I'm also just looking at the language. I mean, I knew even before I heard Blue start screaming, and I'm thinking fingers, toes, ears, nose. It was going to do the same to him. I said, it's going to be all right, Richie. Yes, Richie, I'll take you home. And he punches the shank into the vein in Richie's neck and holds him until he bleeds out and was still. And then there's JoJo barely able to hear Pop because of Richie screaming, and Pop working his hands like he's not sure what they can do. And that line just is the haunting one for me of Pop's trauma. And I'm thinking how that trauma is Richie. I mean, Pop's Richie trauma is not just about Richie. It's also about Given. Throughout this novel, we haven't heard him talk about Given. Other characters have, but I don't think that Pop has. And now he says that the smell of the body he's never been able to lose. When Given died, I thought I'd drown in it. Didn't nothing come close to easing it until you come along, which tells us something about JoJo's importance to Pop, but that move, that leap from Richie to Given is one that he voices, and I'm just thinking about Pop's trauma and what he hasn't been able to say before.
Yeah,
And I think that connects to the question about the termites. Yeah.
Yeah.
It just keeps building until finally, what does he tell JoJo? You have to get him out. I can't remember the exact line when he was telling him about the termites, but otherwise they'll eat it from the inside.
In a way, it does seem that telling it is healing for Pop. I mean, JoJo, but it's not healing for Richie. Richie thinks it will heal him, but it doesn't. Yeah.
Exactly.
Joe Ellen?
Yeah, it's cathartic for Pop. This whole chapter is, I think, rehearsing the trauma. He's been described as a buzzard, escaping, looking at Mama, but circling around all the time. I can't remember whether it's JoJo or Leonie who comment on him, always doing something where he can make a difference because he can't do anything for his wife. And clearly in telling this story, it's worse than to look at his wife dying. And he needs to get it out, like the termites, he's being eaten inside. But, and he tells the story of killing Richie to avoid worse, to protect Richie. At the same time, he thinks he's protecting himself, I think. But JoJo's importance, besides being, there's a cross in action here by the end of the chapter, where JoJo is cradling his grandfather, or his grandfather, but he also is a conduit to getting the story out. Richie is there poking at JoJo, but JoJo is the one poking at his father or his grandfather, helping that catharsis.
Anything else about this scene in the novel?
Yeah, she mentioned how he was doing this to protect Richie, but also himself as well. So yes, definitely. And I think that, especially, of course, he says he stabs him in the neck, because otherwise he wants to be quick and fast. Then he wants to hold him until he's gone. But he knows that if he just leaves him that way, that he might actually be next, because the men who have all gathered, what does he say? I can't remember how many, but way too many that's actually needed, that they would like to make a show of it like they've done with the other convict, inmate, whatever you like to call them. So he now has to put the dogs on him. And that speaks to the question that you asked about earlier in one of our readings, Suzanne, about why he doesn't want to own dogs anymore. So I just wanted to point that out.
I wanted to ask about that. Does he sick the dogs on him? I thought he was trying to send the dogs away, but the dogs came anyway.
No. He does it intentionally to make it look as if he hunted Richie with the dogs, like he would be expected to do if he were anybody else. But he doesn't want to just initially allow the dogs to attack him, because that would be too long of suffering and trauma. But if he doesn't do this, then he might actually be punished for it, because he wouldn't be doing his job.
Oh, I totally missed that.
Suzanne, I think that him turning the dogs away was very temporary. I think something, I don't remember, I think something had happened, but clearly he's tracking him to find him. But he also kills Richie the way he kills a goat. There's a kind of loop back here. And the killing of the goat is to keep his family alive for food, as part of the whole natural process. Here, there's a different reason, but it's done compassionately again.
Definitely.
I would love to color.
Oh, sorry.
He said, I laid him down on the ground, told the dogs to get. They smelled blood, tore into him. Yeah, it's ambiguous to me, but
just a quick some of the comments
he's
in the
guilty,
chat.
and I think so you must be right, Kamisha, that he's that sense of guilt and that washing his hands, that he has saved himself here as well.
I don't think he necessarily saved himself from the men who are also hunting, because he could easily be hunted as well. So it has to appear that he's done his job as the man who's supposed to be handling the dogs and hunting the escapee. Because if he just kills him on his own lovingly with the knife, then he might actually again have dogs turned on him. Does that make sense?
Yes. And in fact, Suzanne, get means that River was basically sicking the dogs on Richie to make it appear they had killed him, I think.
I think of get as saying, get away. So that's
no.
Get is go on.
Yeah.
I would love to draw our attention to some brief, quick comments in the chat. Some folks are noticing parallels to George and Lenny of Mice and Men, or perhaps even of Beloved by Toni Morrison.
Definitely, there's been a lot of Beloved comparisons. I didn't make the connection between of Mice and Men, but I could perhaps see how, especially when he's holding him in that particular moment. But actually, when I interviewed Jesmyn Ward, and she talked about perhaps one of her novels being set to the big screen and film. So if that comes, I broke it first. But she mentioned this perhaps being an option, and thinking about all the comparisons that would be made to Beloved, and the spirits kind of roaming around. But yeah.
Pearl.
You might have already said this before I was able to join in, but I always read that as more of a mercy killing. Much better to have the dogs do it than to have the white men, who are so corrupt to begin with, tear him apart and kill him. So I thought it was like the better choice of bad choices.
Yeah, the stabbing definitely is the mercy killing,
right?
But the sicking the dogs is more covering his own tracks.
I think so. I thought still that okay.
Yeah.
We can agree to disagree, though, but that's always how
that makes sense to me. I'm at peace with it, because the guilt, the overwhelming guilt he feels, that's the reason for that. Not for the killing itself, but for saving himself, I think. Beverly.
He also says that that's why he was released from
Yes.
Parchment.
Right.
And so that I would think would make him guilty. I don't know that that figured into, my view at the time that I read this was that it was out of compassion because he saw the other guy being taken apart piece by piece by piece, and he didn't want Richie to have to do that. But then, killing him yourself, letting the dogs tear him apart so the wound in his neck won't be identified as Pop killing him, Rev killing him. But then on top of that, he gets released.
Right.
And when he goes home to tell Richie's mother what's happened to him, she pretty much shuts the door in his face. And so he's, I can certainly see how he would just be consumed with guilt over the way that whole thing went, even if he feels that that was the right thing to do.
Yeah. And the fact that he's released, so that's his reward for doing a good
Right.
job. But had he not done that, then he could have easily been punished.
Right.
So that's why I say he was covering his own tracks.
And that would explain why it's not a matter of closure for Richie, because Richie was looking for Riv as the father, the loving father.
Exactly.
And now he cannot see that. Okay, Joellen.
Yeah, I just want to clarify. I really don't think that, we don't know that Riv knew in advance that he would be let out, that was any kind of motive for what he did. And there wasn't the suggestion really that he told Richie's mother. He just said he let her know he was dead. So anyway, I think that it's understandable why River feels guilt, but I don't.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting that he knew that he would be rewarded.
No, I just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know that he needs to feel guilt, but I think one would.
Oh, yes.
Because I think what he did was what he had to do, for the sake of Richie. Yeah. All right, shall we talk about Leone?
And I know I've been rooting for people to empathize with Leone the entire book. And then I was just curious. I was like, and then I wonder, do they still empathize with her now that they've read the end? So I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts.
I think it's interesting that she says that JoJo turns on her for the first thing she did that was right. And saying the litany. Kathy.
I feel like Leone realized that JoJo had her number right after the mother died. When he looked at her, Leone realized he sees me for what I am, for what I lack, and that's why she hit him. I also wanted to say that although the story is so heavy and so sad, I felt so much hope in the two very young children, JoJo and his sister Kayla. I loved the way time went back and forth, and one thing affected another. The past was actually living in the present through the people who experienced it, but there was such hope in Kayla's reaction to things and her ability to see things and move on.
Yeah. And I think that that's why it was so significant for her to be able to be the one to shoo the birds away, to tell them to go home. Because I remember the first time that I actually read that passage. What does it say? I can't remember exactly, but I remember making a note saying that she's going to be okay, that she might be the one to actually break these generational curses. Yes. So I think that that's definitely intentional. And again, is significant or something that's prevalent in all of Ward's works. I made a note that she wrings you dry before she offers you hope. And that's exactly what she does here.
Yeah. Other comments on this scene of Ma'am's death, brought to us through the voice of Leone. I think certainly, surely, Harriet, you go first.
I was just going to talk some about our awareness of what it is that Leonie's doing, and the interchange between Mam and Leonie. I'm thinking back to Leonie's touching her mother, and the text is, "Mama is bleeding under the skin. Everywhere my hands touch, there is blood. Trenches in the sand, filling with seawater underneath, dune." Um, and and then her seeing Richie, Mam seeing Richie, and saying, "Ain't le mist day, no spirit, no God, no mystery. Healing Mo, the dead, vengeful as a beat dog, pulling all the weight of history behind him." That Mam has been is calling for Mam and Bridget, mother of all the Ged, of all of the spirits. I'm just this backdrop of West African or Haitian influenced Louisiana, maybe Voodoo, with the idea that everything is spirit, and that spirits influence daily life, and that people connect to them through ritual and music and dance, and Leonie, against her will, is going to be the channel for this encounter as she dance with us, as she calls the mother spirits. And Jojo, who says to her, "You see," meaning that she doesn't see Richie. But Richie, Jojo sees, but he doesn't understand. He doesn't understand what's going on with her daughter in the scene.
Yeah, and Jojo can't accept death in this case, or the need for Mam's death, and Leonie knows it has to come, and she has to be released. Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of the things. If we remember when Richie was telling JoJo that there are still so many things he doesn't know about, he talked about time and love and what was the third thing? But time is speaking again to Mam's death, the inevitable, the fact that she does have to leave and go away. So that's something that he's still reckoning with. But I thought it was interesting. Mam, of course, Harriet talked about the spirits. Mam, of course, says that she knows things before they happen, but she told Leonie beforehand that she had never been able to actually see a ghost or to see a spirit. But she sees Richie, and I thought that it was interesting. She described him vengeful as a beat dog because we don't necessarily get that. Of course, we know that he wants to know the end of his story, but it's after he hears the story that now he's vengeful as a beat dog. So I think that speaks to, again, the fact that he thought that it would be the thing that would allow him to be ushered into home or heaven as he sees it. But clearly that was not the case. That somebody spoke to that earlier.
I think it's interesting. He seems to be acting both in vengeance and in the need for Mam and for the kind of love Mam offers. And so vengeance against Pop in a sense, but then also for Mam. And it's interesting to me that Gibbon doesn't act until until Jojo speaks out against Richie. And that releases Gibbon to act to save his mother. And then calls Richie nephew. Richie calls him uncle. And there are these recognitions of the closeness of family, the bonds of family.
And that's why I asked again about Lynn, if we thought that maybe she too had the gift. And that was why she was able to see Given, or if we just thought it was hallucinations from her drug binge. Because clearly Given is still hanging around for a reason. I was just curious about you all's thoughts about that.
It seems to me she's a person who is not true to her talents, who has them, finally won't embrace them. won't become like ma'am, but Kayla will. Maybe. Okay, Joe Ellen.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think it's dramatized in this chapter where Leonie can go so far. She collects the things that Ma'am wanted and she kicks the rocks over toward the altar. But Given is the one, Jojo and Given are the ones who can go further with their gifts. Leonie still sees Given in this chapter. But and at the end, she wants to hit him. She's wanting to slap everyone. So she comes up short. She can't see this through, whereas it takes Given and Jojo for Ma'am to depart in the way that she's wanted to.
Yeah. Valerie.
I'm wondering if you all feel the same at this point in the story and in the last chapter as well, disappointment in Leonie. Because I really thought that in the earlier parts of the story, we would see her rise up and be the person that she needs to be for her children and for her family as a whole. But she doesn't. She really just collapses back into addiction and distance and isolation from her family. And a related thought I have too is like, who is the main character? Or is there a main character in this story? Or as someone, maybe Dr. Swanson was just sort of suggesting, maybe the family is the main character in this story.
That was exactly what I was going to say, the family. But
yeah, well, I mean, you don't expect that to be in a book like this. You expect Jojo really to carry the weight of the main character. But about halfway through, I thought, no, this is going to be Leonie's story of almost like resurrection of becoming a fully alive human being instead of someone who's just not being responsible, not fully living her life. But it's interesting to think of the main character as the family, and Kayla and Jojo holding out hope for the family.
Yeah, I think I mentioned this in a previous weekly discussion. Even though Ma'am is bedridden the whole time and only has a few words to say herself, we learn so much about her as well. So definitely it's not just one person who is more significant or more important or who's the protagonist, but I think it's supposed to be the family. But I think that it's also perfectly fine for you to be disappointed in Leonie. She has stated several times that she has been a disappointment to everybody, to Given, to her mom, to her dad, to her children. But she knows at the end of that chapter, I can't be a mother right now. I can't be a daughter. I can't remember. I can't see. I can't breathe. And even though Jojo too is disappointed, he still has hope for her. He empathizes with her now. He says that after Ma'am's death, he can finally understand Leonie. So I don't think that disappointment is supposed to be the only thing that you feel.
Pearl and then Beverly.
I really like Valerie's response that she's so disappointed and we're all sort of accepting that. So my question really is, what was Ward thinking? I mean, why does Ward let Leonie be this big disappointment? Why does she, what's the point of that? What's the message that Leonie can't find herself and can't move to the next stage, and it's just disappointment to all of us and to herself? What do you think Ward is trying to say there?
I think it's just realism. So she tries to paint realistic characters. She can't just give everybody a happy ending because everybody does not give a happy ending. I can't remember the exact quote, but when Leonie's looking for the berries to make the potion for Kayla, she says the world doesn't always give you what you need, and she's the exact answer or example of that there won't always be a happy ending.
I think if she had made this revolutionary change here at the end, we might be criticizing Ward for that decision ourselves. Yeah, Beverly.
I thought it was when thinking about the different narrators. Of course, Michael's not family, and the girlfriend that goes with him to Parchment's not family. But I would have liked to have Given have a chapter or two. We get him only through other people, mostly Leonie. And, I would like to know what his story would be. If he would go back and say, he says when Pop's trying, ragging him, I think Leonie's the one telling us this about Pop ragging him about his grades, and he doesn't care about anything but football and shooting that bow and arrow. And he says something like he needs to get the stick out of his ass or something like that. If we would know if he rethought that and had more respect for Pop than he did through Leonie's eyes.
Another book. Harry?
Yeah, I was thinking in relation to what Beverly's saying, the extent to which Ward is responding to and rewriting as lay dying. Her model book here is, or the allusion is to a book that has maybe 13 different narrators. I'm making this up now because I don't remember the number. Maybe 56 sections. That there is no central character. All the characters are central, and she does something slightly different because, as you said, she doesn't give voice to everybody in this book. She starts it off with Jojo and Leonie, and then her editor says, maybe you should try a section on Richie. So glad that you did. But I'm also thinking about our sense of Leonie and our disappointment that this is a book which is, if it's on the one hand about Parchment and racism, it's also about addiction. It's also about racism and addiction. And we have this wonderful sense of Leonie's gift and of her being able to channel, to bring the river. Jojo says that your word led in a river. That's what took her and Uncle Given away, blaming her. But we don't see it that way. We see it as that she's channeled her mother's spirits and led in a river. And just at the moment when we're feeling as if she may be able to change things, she responds to the loss, to the death, and maybe even to the guilt. I mean, I was thinking back when we were talking about Pop's guilt, and doing something that he didn't want to do, having to send Richie on his way, and Leonie not wanting to let Mom go, but also doing what she needed me to do. That there is that all of that is backdrop to I can't be a mother right now. I can't be a daughter. I can't remember. I can't see. I can't breathe. And my sense, that Leonie doesn't have resources that we want her to have. We want her to survive better than she's going to. And in the beginning of the next chapter, Jojo, when he says that he understands why he might have done this, and that he feels the same thing, and that when it comes to him walks, that he has better resources for dealing with the trauma that they're both experiencing. But I'm just wanted to add that I think that reason that, to go back to Beverly's question, or I think it was Beverly, or why, maybe it was Pearl, why Ward would do this. I think that it's a portrait of addiction, and why addiction is a problem.
Maybe also guilt too. I mean, if Pop is guilty about Richie. She feels she's done the right thing by her mother, but nobody wants to do that. No. So anyway, Joellen?
I think Leonie is a portrait of addiction. And I think that something about her name just fell into place. Remember when Jojo is naming constellations in the sky, and he mentions several, and Riv says, "You forgot the lion." And Leonie does mean lion. But there's, we've been reaching back for, mythical allusions or help here. And the chimera has the head of a lion, the body of a goat, and I think the tail of a serpent. And somehow there's fire, but it's a kind of monster. And I think that we have here a portrait of Leonie made monstrous. I mean, even at the end, I mean, she can't get her mother all the way through. She does leave her family. Jojo recognizes that his grandmother was exactly right, and he tells his mother that she can't give him anything, and he's right. I don't think that's him sending her out the door, but I do think that Leonie is that kind of figure.
Yeah,
I'd love to.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Kamisha.
No, I was just gonna say I agree that I don't think that that's sending, as she said, sending her out the door, because, and I'm not gonna find the page right now, but he does make a note when he's asking Pop, have they been by? He says something along the lines, basically he has hope that maybe she might come back by at some point or something like that. And I'm not gonna remember the exact page, but yeah.
We should talk briefly, we're almost out of time, about the last section here.
As we move that direction, I would love to read some of the engaging comments here in the chat that have been relevant to some of the discussion we've been going on. Rachel Aaron Bryan offers that Leonie she gives her some grace that she, quote, ushers in her gods for her mother, and that requires so much personal sacrifice for her. But there is a significant recognition that she is a disappointment throughout. But Rachel can see her as one of the most sympathetic characters in all of literature, because she is self-aware of how limited her love has become out of her grief. And it gives her mother, and still is able to give her mother some sort of spiritual mercy when no one else can. Joellen offered too that Jojo as the main character, and their central characters such as Mam and River, but Jojo is the main character who develops. And then there's some agreeing that there's a sense of reality here. Sorry, that was a lot. A lot more. It kind of kept going.
Misha, do you want to say something about the last chapter before we give up the ghost here, so to speak?
I just thought it was, of course, Jojo is saying that he'd been going on these walks hoping that he would see Mam, but he knows that that's never going to happen. And that's speaking to the fact that Mam went away peacefully, unlike Richie, and later we'll find out many others who have been kind of tethered again between these two worlds, especially when I think it starts on page 282 at the bottom, when Richie begins to describe all the different people that like him that he's met, and then the birds. Wait, who is this? Richie who's describing? Let me look back. Let's see. The branches are full. They are all full with ghosts, 2 or 3, all the way up to the top, to the feathered leaves. There are women and men and boys and girls, some of them near to babies. They crouch, looking at me, black and brown. And then it goes on to continue to describe them. But it's talking about generations of suffering. And I think that speaks to this idea of time, but also trauma. Speaks to the quote, of course, that we use, the connections between Welty, past, present, future, also all kind of intermingling. But definitely this idea of trauma living on was one of the things that I saw most significant. And then, of course, like I said, Kayla being the one to actually usher the spirits away and offering that hope that we wanted to perhaps get through Leonie, but seeing that the next generation would possibly be able to do better.
So just to clarify that comment right there, John Browning asks in the comments, does Kayla free all of the ghosts then? Do you think that is what's occurring?
I don't think that they ever make it to whatever that place is across the water, across the horizons. But she does send them away, if that makes sense. Because it kind of implies that this the hurt and the pain might not be able to go away, which is why the river flows backwards, as someone mentioned earlier. So I don't think it frees them in a sense that they make it to that place over the water. But somebody else might have a different reading.
Joellen, do you want to offer?
Just quick thing. Who is saying home in the last line? Home. They say home.
I had
Everyone?
read it as those spirits, those lost.
I did at first, and then I wondered whether it was the family. I think that probably could be broadened. But that also I'm sorry that I had to miss most of this discussion, but it has also seemed to me, especially since Derek Walcott has an epigraph included, that Omeros could certainly have been in Jesmyn Ward's mind with the Caribbean link. But they're all the elements of the old stories, like the Odyssey and Ulysses, even with the notion of home at the end after, so that's some road trip. But also, yes is a word that figures. And that's how Ulysses ends, on a yes. So anyway, just a couple of observations, things that have been going through my mind as I've read. Thanks for doing this.
Shall we give you the last word? We probably are going to give the last word to Anna, but the next to the
last word on Ward, at least, is for Kamisha.
Well, I really just wanted to say that I really enjoyed this conversation. You all actually made me think about the book in different ways that I had previously. Of course, I talked about trauma and type of trauma theory that she's trying to speak to. Other people mentioned African spiritualism, but other themes and conversations that she's engaging with, I just want us to be thinking about that. Also, like eco-criticism, of course, critical race theory, all these other theories that she's addressing in this one book, but also making it both beautiful and disheartening at the same time. That's something that I love about Ward, that she's willing to play with the messiness of it all. And I hope that you all appreciated it. I know that early on somebody said that they were having dreams, and that sounded a little bit scary. I hope that there was some peace after. But I just really enjoyed this conversation. I hope that you all did as well.
And we're very grateful to you, Kamisha, for leading us through this wonderful book.
Yes, thank you all for being a part of this discussion. Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, Kamisha. Thank you to the Mississippi Department of Archives and History and to the Eudora Welty Foundation. Again, that final recording of today's discussion will go out in the Welty at Home newsletter, and I will also be including a link to the transcript of the chat for this whole series, since there's been such enriching conversation and engagement in the chat for this series. And I will continue to work towards making that available to you guys in future series as we move forward. So with that, a tradition by now is that we like to share our next book club pick at the end of every session. And so, as you know, the Welty at Home alternates works by Welty with works by authors connected to Welty. And with that, after a brief break, we will return with a discussion of Eudora Welty's The Shoebird, her only children's book, as well as some of her related correspondence and reviews of children's literature and fairy tales. Suzanne, would you like to add any more words on that?
I think, no, I look forward to this. I think that is the only Welty work of fiction we haven't discussed, so we will add that to our list, and we'll also discuss some correspondence and some nonfiction in relation to it. So I think we'll have an interesting time talking about The Shoebird, related text.
Wonderful. Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Bye. Don't forget the conference, the Welty, You Are a Welty conference, April 9th through 13th in Jackson. Yeah.
And maybe you can put the link to the conference in the mailing.
Will do.
Thanks.
All right. Ta-ta for now.